Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Calls for Thought. Now we have a title for the series. We can use it at the beginning. So my name's George Holman,
And my name's Ed Wells.
and thanks to everyone for listening in. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that crosses over industries, crosses over sectors, organisations, and it's around incident management and root cause analysis. Before we jump into that, though, and we'll set a bit of context in a second, Ed, just to kick things off, if you were to think about RCA and what you knew 5 years ago, is there something that you now know that you wish you knew then?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that I now know that I wish I knew then, but if I had to select one from the top of what's a very long list, it's probably around time and resource. I think when I first started working in the field of root cause analysis, the assumption that I had, and I'm not sure exactly where I got it from, but the assumption I had was that a good RCA was a big RCA, that for RCA to work, it had to involve a lot of resource and a lot of time. That sense of a sort of ultra deep dive would have been my default position, I think. But certainly over the last few years, I've not only began to sort of soften on that position. I think I probably wholesale reject it, to be honest. In as much as I think that small, rapid, repeat RCAs on issues ultimately come together to produce more value than getting kind of pulled into, a forensic level RCA that sort of burns resource at an unacceptable rate. I mean, I hadn't heard the phrase until last year, but somebody said, the juice has got to be worth the squeeze. And I think that actually, when RCA becomes a way of thinking, the juice is nearly always worth the squeeze.
Okay.
And
Mine would probably be that I think often we associate doing things like root cause analysis with where something has gone wrong, which is clearly what we're going to be talking about in this episode. But I think a kind of moment of realization for me is where we should actually use root cause analysis to where something has gone well, and where we should be looking to amplify behaviors and culture and processes and systems that have led to a positive outcome. Actually, there's real value in being able to identify what caused something going well and then looking to repeat that. And for me, that is something that certainly was more enlightening for me more recently, and I think we should encourage others to do as well.
well, I mean, I think you've trumped my answer with that one, because more than ever, I think there's value in that. I mean, clearly, and I'm pleased to say this out loud, that sounds like another podcast in its own right,
Yep.
and deservedly so. I would certainly say that in the last few years, I've seen more and more activity, what we might call the positive RCA. I've seen that happen much more frequently. I used to say to classrooms that it was a sort of poor relation in the RCA world, and that only a tiny percentage of all RCA activity was investigating what went well so that we can replicate it. And although there's still a degree of truth in that, I've no doubt at all from what I've seen and experienced that type of RCA is on the up. In fact, the last two RCAs that I've been involved with hands-on have both been strategy-orientated RCAs. So this is people starting off with a sort of focal point that they want to achieve a given goal, and then using their RCA thinking to navigate their way to what the root causes of success would be.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we're going to have to pivot into where things go wrong, fortunately or unfortunately. So wanting to talk about incident management, and I'm going to just frame this conversation, Ed, by asking you a little bit of a provocative topical question. So if I were to say these three things to you, what would you think of? So General Assembly, an escalator stopping, and a teleprompter not working properly.
I would say they're all things that go wrong that would be outside of my control, George. But that's an interesting question. You're obviously leading me somewhere in particular, so I've got to decide whether I want to travel with you on this one or not.
So why do I say this, apart from it sounding just like a really random list of stuff? Quite recently, there was a series of incidents that happened at the UN General Council that resulted in, I would say, Donald Trump being quite embarrassed by an escalator stopping and a teleprompter not working, which led to him kind of delivering his speech unaided or without a script. And why do I mention this? The reason is because there was a temptation to call something out quickly without proper analysis as to the reason why these things had gone wrong. And actually, pretty quickly after the event, what he had said around him being ambushed or something being done nefariously was disavowed. And it was proven to be something that was actually quite vanilla. I think it was someone treading on a button by mistake. So a bit of a fun, kind of topical question that hopefully helps to frame people's minds around looking for actually what has gone wrong rather than jumping to conclusions.
There's always that temptation to jump to conclusions, isn't there, around what happened? And some of that's born from frustration. Some of it's born from a lack of information. Some of that is born from the fact that the one resource we never feel that we have enough of is time. And also, we like structure and we like rules. And for some of us, when those structures or rules break down around us, the natural conclusion that we can come to is that that didn't happen by accident, that somebody must have dismantled those rules. But I think sometimes when I'm introducing the concept of root cause analysis, and whether that's in person or whether that's a presentation, if I'm speaking, I'll often begin that presentation by actually describing the why of root cause analysis rather than the what it is or the how it's done. That comes later. And the why, in my mind, is quite simple. You have to justify why you exist as a discipline or an organization. And the why for us is summed up by a quote from 100 years ago from the American public figure H.L. Mencken. Mencken was the Stephen Fry of his time in sort of pre-television America in the 1930s. Probably not as famous as he would have been had he lived another 20 years later once the TV age had come in. But back in those days, he was everywhere. He could have been famous for many things, and indeed he probably is, but something which I think would surprise him is that one of his quotes, which was probably a throwaway comment at the time, has stood the test of time, and every other book I open on problem solving has got this quote hidden in there somewhere. And Mencken's quote was, "For every complex problem, there's an answer that's clear, simple, and usually wrong." And what he really managed to almost capture in that quote was that as human beings, we like a simple explanation for a problem. No matter how complex that problem is, simplicity is really attractive to us for a whole host of psychological reasons. And that simplicity is what can often trip us up. So I'm not surprised that you mention that people get frustrated and want a simple, easy answer to that, which justifies their beliefs that they had before the event even took place. And the example you give is a prime one of that. Bit of bias in there being affirmed.
Yeah, and the bias, and you layer into that as well. I think you make an interesting point around that kind of human psychological element that we all have, right? Is natural to us. But in our minds, it's easy to look for a single problem, or it's easy to be able to draw a straight line between X event has happened and this is what caused it. And it might be that we have proof and data and information to be able to back that assertion. But equally, it might be that there are other things going on, either, on the outside or on the inside, that make us think or feel a certain way and are drawn towards maybe, in some cases, drawing and jumping to that conclusion.
Sure. I think that what you're talking about there, the assertion comes, generally speaking, before the data. It takes time to bring up information and make sense in a contextual way about an event that's taken place. It takes no time at all to jump to a conclusion or place an assertion. And I think that nature abhors a vacuum, as they say. We psychologically don't like to have a sense of not knowing what happened, and we'll fill that vacuum with whatever is close to hand, won't we? And I think it doesn't matter how complex the event is. And you'd think in this day and age where information and data were so readily available, and we have, you know, previous examples of any type of event that you can think of, that this jumping to a conclusion would stop. But I can guarantee you that every time there's an aviation disaster and a plane, unfortunately, is involved in an incident, when it's reported in the newspapers or on the online news services, certainly in the early days, you don't have to go far into that article to see the two words pilot error. I mean, they're always there, and they're nearly always the initial conclusion. And then as data is uncovered, we find out that, of course, there are multiple causes for the event, and that rendering it down to one human action is sometimes at best incomplete, and at other times completely wrong.
So why then, Ed, do you think, either due to the need to find a solution or the need to kind of show that we're doing something, why do you think that we end up defaulting to human error?
I think we default to human error because it gives us that level of comfort, as described earlier. Without the necessary structure, I think it's an easy place for us to go. When we think about incidents that have taken place, it's much easier for us at a superficial level to look at the things that happened and the things that changed in the event, and we'll often ignore things that were there, things that existed, or things that should have existed that didn't. So there's the actions that take place in an event are very obvious to us because, well, they're dynamic, they change, we see them. They very often involve our friends and colleagues. So we put a large amount of focus on activity and points of change. What we put less focus on is everything else. So the processes that existed at the time, the systems in place, the equipment and tools that we were interacting with at the time. And importantly, the other thing we often overlook is what we would maybe call the environment, which might be the physical environment that exists at the time, but also the cultural workplace environment. They're all different pressures that exist at the time. And I wouldn't say those elements are invisible, but they're far less immediate and they're far less obvious. So we make sense of the world by looking at what changed and what actions took place. And that usually involves us as human beings. So I think that's why we get there initially. Every other element of an incident that takes place is less obvious, a little more subtle, and also needs to be understood as in terms of systems. The interaction between all of these things is really important. There was an American investigator, I think he was the chief federal investigator in the States in the 1980s. His name was Chuck Perot, I think his name was. I might be wrong. We may have to correct that in the edit, George, I'm afraid. He was nicknamed, he had the moniker, the Master of Disasters, because whenever something substantial happened in the USA, Charles Perot would be one of the chief investigators, go and check things out. And he was famous for just pointing out that it's the interaction of complex systems that is what you need to be looking at. Not just the fact that the complex systems exist, but it's the interaction between those systems where you will really find the complexity. And that will explain. Don't just look for what's there, look for how the things that are there are linked to one another. And, his theories, which were, somewhat cutting edge at the time, and we take for granted now, he'd say complexity isn't enough to generate risk. He said, really, in systems that fail, you see complexity in combination with something that he called, from memory, tight coupling. In other words, you've got a complex system with very little redundancy built into it. So that if one part of that system fails, then there's a very, very high percentage that you can't get back on top of it. So complexity is fine. If you've got lots of redundancy between the various moving parts, and something goes wrong, you can get in there quickly and you can stop it from getting away from you. But without that space, without that capacity, that redundancy, then that's the type of system which has the propensity, the likelihood to cause you serious problems.
And that's such an interesting point around the layers of complexity. I almost think of it like an onion or the rings of a tree, right? Where the more you have, almost the more time and space you probably need to truly understand what has happened, what the causation is or has been. But I've found, certainly in my background in risk management working in banks, the more complex something is, typically the effect and the impact are greater, and therefore you have someone banging the desk demanding answers quickly. We need to understand what has happened. We need to put our finger in the dam to prevent reoccurrence. And actually, it's in those scenarios where you absolutely need to be able to slow down to really analyze, rather than charging in full steam ahead, thinking we know the answer, using bias to back it up. And it's almost that logic is where you have complexity, is really where you need to be able to do the analysis. But often we end up in an environment where, just by the forces of nature around us and the influences that we have, we end up doing the opposite.
So, in your experience, if I understand that correctly, really what you're saying there is that there's a paradox at play here, in as much as sometimes the events that demand the highest level of analysis are arguably those that might not get it.
Absolutely. And I can remember examples where, on the incident response team, to things that have gone wrong, and they are real life impacting incidents, the greater the effect and the impact, the less time you have to remediate. And that might be because of client expectations, internal expectations, regulatory kind of concerns, all of the above. Could be more. But kind of the greater this pressure that comes from externally to the incident response team, there can be that temptation to go fast, to find what you think is going to be the mitigating thing or things, and maybe compromise slightly on the analysis and bringing in the evidence to kind of back up what you think or what you're being told.
So, arguably, what you're describing there is confusion, isn't it? There can be a confusion between incident response and incident investigation or analysis. And when we don't separate those two elements, we end up serving, I should say, two goals at the same time, and they become muddled. And I guess in that situation, there's every chance that you do neither of them particularly well.
That's right. I mean, I've been involved in probably more incidents than I'd care to remember. Some of them were quite significant, and I always found where you had the ability to respond to the incident, but then also take the proper time, due diligence, and do the analysis that got you to the right answers in terms of identifying the risk, the potential for reoccurrence, properly looking through process, people and systems to really understand what had gone wrong, but then come up with proportionate, effective solutions. That is where you come to the best answer typically, rather than you feel that external pressure, someone, as I said, banging the desk, demanding answers. This needs to be closed immediately. There can be that rush. And when you rush, things can get missed or overlooked.
Yeah, I think if you draw that back to root cause analysis, there can be a temptation to think of problems in a very linear nature, looking for a sort of single line of causality, which takes you straight from the event that you're looking at to a singular root cause, which unfortunately in that mindset very often goes to blame. Not always, but it often does, and it presents to you in that sort of very linear chain of causality. It presents to you a simple solution to what is a very complex issue. When you take the time to even look at what one might call sort of simple events, there's never singular causality. And certainly that causality is if you look, I use an example of a sort of torch beam. Okay, and I sometimes will use this example if I'm communicating RCA to people who perhaps haven't experienced it before. And I say to them, look, if you're thinking about a problem in terms of single chain of causality, what we sometimes call a 5 whys, it's the equivalent of being in a, let's do a cartoon. Let's put ourselves in an episode of Scooby Doo right now. We're in a dark warehouse, right, and it's scary, and we've got to navigate from one side of that warehouse to the other safely. And we know that there's lots of trip hazards and heaven knows what else in that warehouse, but we've got to get out of there. If you had a torch with you, you wouldn't switch that torch on in the narrowest beam setting that it offers, and you point that torch in one direction and one direction only, and assume that you've seen all there is to see in terms of the risk ahead of you. No one would do that. What they'd actually do is they'd open the aperture up on that torch to the widest possible beam and they'd wave it around. And by doing those two things, you can suddenly see what's in front of you, and then you can navigate from A to B in the safest possible way. Now, that's how I see the benefits of root cause analysis, opening that torch up and giving me the full view of the risk ahead of me, or the contributing factors to the event that I'm looking at, or indeed, going back to our earlier conversation, all the possible options I could have for success. I wouldn't keep the torch beam on the narrowest beam, because it's just going to give me a partial picture at best. And it may even give me the wrong picture. It may even suggest to me that there isn't any risk ahead. And then I barrel in and risk hits me between the eyes. Or it might actually show me that it's only risk ahead and I don't act. I'm frozen. I'm petrified because it looks too difficult, because I can't see the success route ahead of me. So either way, any kind of visual analysis that takes place, you really want to make sure that you're opening that lens up as wide as you can, because ultimately then you're giving yourself more options for success moving forward.
And just to build on that as well, Ed, root cause analysis has become right in the crosshairs of what our regulatory authorities expect. Right. So I think, we are certainly familiar with a lot of the recent publications and press releases by the likes of the FCA, by the likes of the Chinese regulator, who are looking for greater scrutiny when something goes wrong. What they are no longer going to accept and be happy with is a firm, compiling an incident report that feels comprehensive, but I think to your example earlier is maybe just long, and therefore you go, oh, it probably, covers all the detail. They actually want to understand your workings, right? So it's understanding how you got to the point you got to, what was the method that was used to get there, what was the data and the information, how have you recorded that, can you present that in a way that is understood, that it is brought you to the point of being able to prevent reoccurrence. So rather than being an exercise in just responding to an incident, it actually becomes around risk reduction and risk management, because obviously in the eyes of the regulators, they're concerned about organizations and their response, but they're also concerned about consumers, clients, and broader markets as well. And in their view, using root cause analysis is a way that it gives greater comfort around proper risk management.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I will encounter lots of publications from regulators across all industries, and sometimes we'll even be on a panel or talking directly with representatives of the FRC or the FCA or the HSE or whoever else it might be. And what I can say without any doubt is that, yeah, they are looking for more than just tick box exercises. There's been plenty of that. They don't need any more of that. They'll talk about using root cause analysis as a tool to get beyond the symptoms, and also they want organizations to uncover many of the hidden causes. I think everybody's quite comfortable that the upfront obvious causes are known and firms can put remedial actions in place to correct those where possible. But if you don't go further, then the underlying contributors to those well-known symptoms are probably going to go unaddressed. And there's this cultural approach that regulators talk of, this RCA mindset. They look at where root cause analysis has been successful in the past 50 or 60 years, and aviation is often a good example. And they'll want to encourage that way of thinking. I mean, one of the great mindset changes in aviation around 50 years ago was how they started to deal with near miss events, and it's often cited as the point of change, the turning point in that industry. Now, I have seen some graphs. I'm not going to get the dates right, so I'm going to have to apologize in advance. But you can see how much safer aviation became. I think it was roughly speaking in the early 1970s. Now, there were technological changes and there were environmental changes that helped. But fundamentally, organizations in the industry started to treat near miss events with the same amount of rigor as they did actual events. And of course, what that did was it gave them infinitely more raw material to investigate. And that transfer of information from that wider data set, if you like, enabled the whole industry to learn. And the curve in terms of safety is quite remarkable. So to some extent, a lot of regulators elsewhere than other sectors, want to see this RCA mindset. They want to see it as a culture as much as a process. Now, RCA is a process. There's many different types of processes, and we could argue till we're sort of fairly long in the tooth which processes are better or for worse. And I'm sure we'd bore ourselves eventually on that topic. But the cultural element of going in with that mindset that we want to get a better understanding of what happened and not just apportion blame or come up with the same old excuses or same old causes. What most of us want to see, whether you're the regulator or whether you're part of the leadership team, you want to be told something you didn't already know. You want to be. We need to be uncovering those unknowns. The deep unknowns, the things that we could have easily overlooked, or on occasion we discover things that weren't even in our field of vision at the beginning. We never even considered them as a possibility.
And sometimes sacrificing that little bit of speed to get to the right answer or answers is probably more often the case, should actually give you more comfort as a leadership team, right? I think to your point, Ed, if I'm an executive in a bank or a telecoms company or a mechanical engineering firm, something has gone wrong, something potentially quite significant. Yes, we could fix something quickly and move on. That becomes a bit of an optics point, maybe a tick in the box to say, yes, we've done something about
Agreed.
this. Or we can slow down, do the proper analysis, back that up with the data and the information that, we should have. And actually, as a leader, that gives me more comfort that I'm not going to be sat here next month and the month after and the month after talking about the same things, because maybe, to your shining the torch point, we didn't quite shine the torch in the right place because we were trying to go too fast.
Yeah, I think one of the most damaging cliches, if you like, that we will have all heard in our lives, and I'm going to admit I may have even said it out loud myself on more than one occasion, is that old cliche of don't bring me problems, bring me solutions.
Yeah.
Now, that's a well-meaning topic, and I understand where it comes from. As I said, I'm sure I've said it. But the unintended consequences of that are that you're going to encourage people to either jump to conclusions about what happened or jump to conclusions about what we ought to do about it. And in both of those cases, particularly if both things happen, then we're not really doing any analysis. We're essentially sort of throwing darts at a dartboard and hoping that we might, hit where we want to hit every now and again.
So look, I think we've covered a lot of ground there, Ed. If you wanted folks who have listened in or watched this to take one insight away that will be memorable to them, what would it be for you?
Well, I love a fairy tale. I love a parable. And the tale of the hare and the tortoise has stood the test of time for very good reasons. We all know it. We all know the impatient hare that wants to win the race, and little tortoise wins it every single time. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to be taken from those approaches. I think that when you look at root cause analysis as a discipline, and it doesn't matter what method you look at, they all essentially are providing us with a structure to adopt, which, as much as anything, is there to slow us down. All of the RCA processes, no matter whether they've got 4 or 5 steps or 24 steps, all take you on the same journey. And that journey is gather evidence. Don't just go barreling in using your guesswork and imagination. Look at the people involved and the equipment they were using, the systems they were plugged into, the environmental factors that wrapped around them, and all those types of things. Once you've done that, understand the exact problem you need to solve based off of what you know, so that you don't waste time, because that's unforgivable. Once you've got to that point, a key point of root cause analysis is to have a genuine analysis. And that isn't tick boxes, that's not checklists, that's not selecting the next near enough cause from a drop down that sounds just about right and is close enough to explain what happened, because that's not analysis. That's essentially systemized guesswork. Once you've done your analysis properly and you have revealed multiple causes, you've then put yourself in the perfect position to start applying solutions. The more causal factors you understand, the more intelligent and selective you can be about what you're going to do next. And then the final part of all RCA processes is communication, because we need to learn from the mistakes of others, don't we? We don't want to be making mistakes that other people have already made, because they've done the painful work for us. So communication is absolutely key. So, my takeaway, and it's to anybody listening, is understand that slow is fast in this world. It really is. And if you take that away and you embed that in your RCA thinking and your processes, you will be quicker, you will be faster, and you will be more accurate. And over time, the benefits of being a little faster and a little more accurate will compound like interest in a savings account, to the point where you will wonder how you ever did it any other way in the past.
And I think that ties really nicely into my main takeaway, which is that is about the over time mindset. So, if we view incidents as single exceptions, we're pretty likely to be missing the point and the cause, and we're going to implement solutions that might be okay, but they might not be as effective as they could be. So I think for me, when an incident occurs, it's about being able to step back, to your point, Ed, but looking at how they need to be viewed in the wider context of the organization, the department, the team, the individual, whatever it might be, being able to step back and really assess why something has happened, why something might happen again, and then coming up with solutions that actually meet the needs of the business, rather than just fixing one thing that's happened in isolation.
Yeah, and I think if we go back to Mencken's quote, and I'll paraphrase it slightly, but every problem, no matter how complex it is, has a simple answer if you want it. If this is about feeling good, then
optics,
then yeah, fine, absolutely, and we can create those with ease, but that's not really going to satisfy anybody's requirements, both internally or externally.
Super. So look, I think let's bring this episode to a close. Thank you so much to everyone for listening in and watching. The same as last time, we're really open to your feedback, to your ideas, to your topic suggestions. We're not precious, and we want to keep making kind of content that people find useful and informative. But thank you, Ed, and thank you everyone for listening in.
Thank you, George, for the opportunity to speak with you once again.